but because this, thank you, Linda. So because this is such a big topic, we're just going to look at ICH E6R3, just because there's quite a lot in there. I don't know if any of you have had much of a chance to look at it yet. So I'm kind of going to present my take on it, but it'd be really interesting to hear everyone else's kind of ideas and what you've picked up from it as well. I do not have time to go into every single point that is different, because there is a lot of it. Andy Fisher, who is an MHRA inspector, has published a blog post where he does go through point by point, and I've kind of nicked a bit of this stuff from him, but if you want more of the detail, when we send out the handout afterwards, we'll make sure to include a link to that blog as well, because I think he's actually done a pretty good job of trying to pull everything out. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how this pans out in the future, and also what from the draft version makes it into the final version and what else gets added as well. So it is really important to remember as we go through this that we are talking about a draft document. So there is absolutely no guarantee that anything that we talk about today will end up in the final version. There are things that we've been talking about in the industry for many years already, so they probably are going to make it in, but there's no guarantee that the final version will look the same as this. So with that caveat, I will move into my first kind of little section. You're probably aware, but just for completeness, this update is part of the ICH GCP Renovation project. The two main documents that have been involved in this are ICH E8, which is General Considerations for Clinical Trials, which we've looked at before, and then also E6, which is ICH GCP. So ICH E8R1 is now final and has been in place for quite a while, and a lot of the changes that were made with that are filtering through into this new document as well. So we are now at the draft version of ICH E6R3. We don't have the whole document yet, so I'll come back to that in a second. We have the kind of first pass at it, and then there'll be another annex that will be added later on, but they've kind of published the kind of first half of it at this stage. It is released for consultation, so the regulatory authorities, from what I can see, they're kind of facilitating the consultation exercise. So MHRA have released information about the consultation, so have FDA. And there's obviously a lot more information on the ICH website, along with the draft document as well, of course. So all of the information is available online. There has been extensive consultation already on both of these documents, and they had a public meeting last June, or was it even the June before? It might have been June 2020, about E6 and the changes. So they have already kind of taken into account the views of regulators, industry, patients and physicians into this, but obviously now they've got this draft version, there is like a formal consultation process. So the draft version that we have, there is considerable change. There's a lot of new information, quite a lot of changes to terminology and that kind of thing. They've also got a new structure for the document as well, which I'll kind of talk about in a minute. So we've got the introduction of the principles as we had in the original version, and then the rest of the original version is now in Annex 1. So there's this Annex 1, which is basically a kind of a rehash of the current version of ICH GCP. And then there's another annex that will come in the future, which is going to be more around different types of clinical trial design. So my understanding, and if anybody thinks I'm getting this wrong, then please say, my understanding is that Annex 2 will cover the kind of low interventional types of clinical trials and what those risk adaptations might be for those. But I think it's also going to cover the more kind of advanced type of or innovative types of designs as well. So looking at things like adaptive designs, platform trials, basket trials, those kinds of things. I think the Annex 1 is your traditional randomized controlled clinical trial that is being used to apply for marketing authorization, and then Annex 2 is going to cover different types of designs and post-market research as well. That's my understanding, but we'll see obviously when it comes out. The other thing that you do see quite strongly in this, and it comes into the introduction and then you see it all the way through the information, is the strengthening the link between this document and ICH E8. So things like quality by design and critical to quality factors, which came in with E8, are very much themes through this as well. So they're kind of tying the two together a lot more closely as well. So going into the principles, we've had this draft version of the principles for quite a while. So there are quite a lot of changes, quite a lot of new information, but the kind of key things that I picked out are here. So they want to build in a bit more flexibility and adaptability to the requirements, so that the general principles of GCP will always apply, but the practical detail can be adapted for different types of research. And they very much want to see individual assessment of each clinical trial, so evaluation of each trial for quality management. So rather than having a one-size-fits-all approach to managing clinical trials and GCP requirements, they want to have assessment of each trial and then proportionate quality management based on risk and things like critical to quality factors. Engagement of stakeholders is something that, again, they are very keen on. So historically, ICH has really been aimed at regulators and industry, but they are, as I said, they're now really engaging with patients and with physicians as well. And they want to see clinical trial sponsors doing the same thing. So they want to see engagement with patient groups. They want to see engagement with physicians. And potential investigators as well. There is a push to avoid unnecessary complexity and to simplify trial design, and that's where the quality by design bit comes in. So really thinking about your endpoints and what you really need in terms of data and what you don't need. So that's part of it as well. Quality by design I've mentioned, critical to quality factors I've also mentioned, and those feed into a risk-based approach to managing clinical trials. Transparency is also important, so publication on a public database and also publication of results is part of transparency. And then the final point is really emphasising the responsibility of sponsor and investigator. So both sponsor and investigator can delegate task, duties and functions, but they retain responsibility. And that, again, all of this was in the draft principles that we've had for quite a while. So, and there is more in there that's new, but I can't, it's impossible to cover absolutely everything because we'd be here all day, I think. So those are kind of some of the key things that you'll see coming through in some of the other new information that I'm going to present. So that's the kind of first part of the document. You've got the introduction and the principles, and then we go into Annex 1, which is a reworking of the current guideline, the current ICH GCP, the rest of it. They have changed the structure around. So it starts off with responsibilities. We still have the responsibilities of the ethics committee, the investigator and the sponsor. There is then another new section on data governance and data handling, and that covers responsibilities of investigator and sponsor in terms of data governance and computerized systems and all that kind of stuff. So that's a new section. And then the glossary has been moved, because the glossary was at the beginning of the current version. They've moved the glossary to the end of the kind of responsibilities and requirements section. And then they've got 3 appendices, and this is where you get the documents. So you've got a chapter on, in the appendices, you've got an appendix on the investigator's brochure, another one on the protocol, and then a final one on essential records. So the structure's quite, they're covering the same information, but they've added additional information on data governance, and they've moved the glossary, and they've just rejigged the structure a little bit. So going into a little bit more of the detail, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover the sections on IRB and investigator, and then I'm going to give you a chance to have a chat about what we've covered so far, and then we'll go on and look at the rest of it. So in the ethics committee section, there isn't so much change here. There is more information on consent and including e-consent, because obviously decentralized clinical trials are becoming much more common. And so there's a lot more information on making consent understandable and using technology to assist with the consent process. There's also stuff in there around assent for children as well. So there's quite a bit. That's probably the biggest change in this chapter, is all about the consent process. They have removed the requirement for retaining ethics committee records for 3 years, which was in the original version. And one of the things that I think I mentioned earlier, they rather than specifying periods for things or frequencies for things, what they've done is make it in line with local regulatory requirements. So rather than saying 3 years, it's going to be whatever is the requirement locally for record retention. So they're kind of, and this is part of the kind of flexibility and adaptability thing, is that they're being a little bit less prescriptive about certain things, so that it can be in line with local requirements. And the same point applies to the last bit about frequency of continuing review, because the current version says that you have to review, the ethics committee should review a clinical trial at least once a year, and they've taken that out, and what they now are saying is that the ethics committee needs to determine how frequently they want to review the clinical trial, and again in line with local regulatory requirements. So it's kind of a little bit less prescriptive, but they've put in more information around consent and the consent process. So as far as I can see, those are the main changes. Again, there's changes to wording and definitions and that kind of thing, but those are the main changes that I could see in the ethics committee chapter. When it comes to the investigator, there's a lot more change. So I haven't covered it all here because there's a lot of stuff in there. But these are some of the things that I spotted. So the first point about service providers. So if the sponsor is using service providers, the investigator can say that they don't want to use them, or they can say, you know, we want to use this service provider. So for example, I guess I'm trying to think of examples. So, I mean, I guess with a central lab, the investigator for safety reporting, the investigator might decide that they don't want to use the service provider that the sponsor is promoting. I mean, I think, you know, if you were using a central lab for PK samples, then I don't see how they could kind of go against that, really, because they wouldn't be able to provide an alternative. But anyway, that it kind of puts a bit more responsibility on the investigator around use of service providers. It talks about having a proportionate approach to site staff training, so doing an evaluation of whether trial-related activities are outside of their normal scope of work, and then only if it's going to be different from what they normally do, that's when they need training. So I think that's a good step forward, because I think there's a lot of sites will welcome that. So, you know, if they're just doing the same job that they would always do under the supervision of the investigator, then they don't need specialist training. I mentioned about changes to consent in the IRB Ethics Committee chapter, and there's a lot in here as well about consent, because obviously consent comes under investigator responsibilities. So it does go into more emphasis on the fact that the content for the consent, the information for the patients or participants, should be clear and understandable, and that they can use technology to assist with that. So using videos and that kind of thing. And also, again, as I said, it talks about assent materials for children as well. There's also quite a lot in there about data protection for participants, and making sure that the consent outlines how their data are going to be handled and processed. And also, again, with regard to transparency, putting in their information about patients having access to their results and also the results of the clinical trial. So there's quite a lot of other bits and pieces in there, but those are kind of ones that I guess we would probably be expecting to see. And then, as well as the additional section on data governance, there's also additional stuff in the investigators' responsibilities chapter about data control and management and use of computerized systems. So there's a lot of changes and additional guidance. And again, we'd kind of expect this because technology has changed a lot. And, since the original version of GCP was issued however many years ago, 25 it is now, probably. Oh, that's a really long. And the frightening thing is, I can remember when it first came out, which is really scary. So yeah, there has been a lot of change in technology and in how data are managed and how they're handled, and use of computerized systems. So again, there's lots of changes and additional guidance in there for investigators using systems in clinical trials. So that'll be things like computerized patient records and that kind of thing, and e-pros, I guess, as well, and that sort of stuff. So yeah, so there is quite a lot of new information in there. So I'm going to stop there because I've talked for quite a while, and I'm going to split you into groups. So the next section is about sponsor responsibilities, and there's even more, I think, change in this section. So in terms of trial design, again, it's pulling in the stuff from E8 around critical to quality factors, stakeholder engagement, feasibility, and fit for purpose. This is the thing that particularly the likes of Transacelerate have really kind of picked up on, is the fit for purpose assessment of the protocol, and making sure that the protocol is feasible in practice. There are also new sections on qualifications and training. In agreements, they've changed the term CRO and put service provider in, which obviously, does make sense. And again, it talks about sponsor oversight and the sponsor responsibility and making sure that sponsors are demonstrating oversight. There is then the section on quality management and risk-based quality control, quality management. They've taken out the term quality tolerance limit, which I think is quite interesting. I had heard a rumor that this was going to happen. So yeah, quality tolerance limits have gone. And instead it does talk about critical to quality factors in the risk control section as well. It kind of talks about ranges. So it doesn't use the term key risk indicator, but that's the kind of implication that you're looking at metrics with ranges that will allow you to monitor and control for risk. So I've got clients where they're only just getting around to starting to talk about quality tolerance limits, and now it looks like it's going to go. So there's kind of this, well, is it worth doing it now or not? So it's a bit of a tricky one, that, but I think there's always been a lot of confusion between quality tolerance limits and key risk indicators and all of that. So I think this will probably make life easier generally. Then there's a section on QA and QC. So again, they've kind of rejigged the structure of the section, and the QA and QC section now talks about audit and monitoring in the same section. There's a lot of change in terms of the monitoring bit, and it talks about on-site and centralized review. And also they've taken out, I don't know if you remember, the original version says something like, in general, there is a need for on-site monitoring before, during and after the trial. They've taken that out. So you can just do centralized monitoring now, if that's appropriate based on your risk assessment. And then safety reporting, they've included now reference safety information, which is quite interesting because the US don't use that term. Obviously in the EU, we use it, but there is, as you'll see in a minute, in the glossary section, they've included a definition of reference safety information, and they've also put it in the section in the investigator's brochure. Yeah, they are now talking about using the reference safety information for the expectedness assessment. There's provision for a risk-based approach to safety reporting. So again, if you've got like a marketed product where we've got a lot of evidence about side effects already, then you could have a risk-based approach to safety reporting within the protocol for that. And then it also talks about urgent safety issues being reported as well. So as well as kind of the side effect type risks, it's other risks as well, or the safety issues. So that might be something around manufacturing, or results from animal toxicology, or something like that, that present an urgent safety issue. They also need to be reported as well. In terms of IMP, the main changes that I could see seem to be around use of authorised products, and again, having a risk-based approach to using authorised products, and being able to send IMP direct to patients as well, or participants, which obviously we did a lot during COVID. Some countries allow it, some don't, but ICH GCP now does allow it. And then in terms of data handling under the sponsor chapter, again, there's lots of new information. One of the key things is that the sponsor must not have exclusive control of data or documents, particularly like the investigator site file. The investigator must have direct access to that information without having to go through the sponsor, even post-archive. Again, just emphasising that really. And then there's this new section on data governance for investigator and sponsor. There's a lot in there, and we've had new guidance on computerized systems from EMA and from FDA, so a lot of it kind of ties in with those guidance documents as well. Again, there's a lot of focus on critical to quality, critical data, and also including relevant metadata for electronic information. And then also quite a lot around control of records and computerized systems, and, you know, security and all of that sort of stuff as well. And obviously computer systems validation as well comes in here. So, I mean, I've only put a little bit in there, but there's a huge amount of stuff in there that's kind of new. And then, as I mentioned, the glossary has moved to the end of that part of the document. So I guess there may be another glossary that will come in Annex 2. I don't know, that might cover specific terminology to do with specific types of design, because it's not in the main body of it. It's actually in this appendix, or in this annex. They've taken some terms out and they've added some in. So, for example, reference safety information has been added in. I think it's quite helpful that they've taken, apart from reference safety information, they've taken all the other adverse event terminology and they've put it together in one little section. So you can see all the different definitions in one section for adverse event information. And as we are all aware already, I think, we are now talking about participants and not subjects in our clinical trials. So we then move on to the appendices to the annex. which is the documentation bit. I couldn't see a lot different on the protocol section, so I haven't put anything in about that. And in the investigators brochure bit, the reference safety information is now included as part of the IB, as I mentioned earlier. The other thing is the essential documents. It's now essential records, not essential documents, because obviously a lot of them will be electronic information. And they've rejigged that whole section. So it looks very different now from the existing chapter 8. There's a new section on management of records, which again ties in with the data governance and computerized systems bit. There's a new section on identifying essential records. So there's a list of potential essential records, and there's information about how you identify whether something's required for your clinical trial or not. And then the long list of records has been kind of changed. So they've split it into two, and they've got a section that's a list of records that are essential for all clinical trials. So you would expect to see them in any clinical trial. And then there's another list of potential essential records where you have to do that evaluation bit about whether they're required or not. And the other thing that they have done is to take out, because if you remember in chapter 8, they've got the document and then they've got 2 columns for sponsor file and investigator file, and that's gone. So I guess, again, it will be up to the sponsor to make a decision about where those documents need to be filed. And it's not dictating this is only in the sponsor and this is only in the investigator file. So again, it's kind of more vague, really, and less dictated what needs to go where. But it does talk about investigator site file as well, which the old version didn't. So it talks about sponsor TMF and then investigator site files, which I think, again, is quite helpful because that's how everybody tends to talk about them. So I think it helps to clarify that. And then just to try and summarize the common themes. So, I mean, I have literally only scratched the surface in what I've covered so far. There's a huge amount of detail underneath all of this. Flexibility and proportionality are kind of themes running through it. So the risk-based approach and quality by design and critical to quality factors. As I mentioned, there's more reference to local requirements and less dictated information around things like ongoing review, document retention and safety reporting. But there's a lot more in there about control of data and control of computerized systems and records. So that's my kind of it really is just a headline summary of the main changes that I think I saw when I was going through it, with a bit of help from Andy Fisher. So what I'm going to do, we've got just under half an hour left. So